a thought or two about some of the things that I've been thinking about since I was asked to come along to this event. And it was triggered a little bit by one day when my daughter arrived home, my early 20s daughter, not so much a human being walking through the door, but more a big ball of energy, with the occasional hand sticking out here and there with an iPad in it and a phone. And I reached the point where I watched her in action and I said, "Why don't you just telephone him?" And she said, "Dad, we don't do that. We Facebook and text." So feeling really rather old and stupid, I sort of took that thought and reflected upon it and actually thought, where can I actually go with this? And started actually analysing how I've communicated over the years, and have I been completely and utterly left behind? I'm not quite sure that I have, but it suddenly dawned on me that things are a bit different. Before I go into some of the mistakes that I've made over the years and one or two successes I've had with communication, all of which I've done a little bit by accident, because I've never really had any training in it, I found my way through it all, let me introduce you to some of the things that I've done. I was an army officer a long time ago, and then I sort of took a sideways move and became a police officer, spent some time as a detective, or most of my police service as a detective, before taking a year's career break to join the United Nations as a war crimes investigator, and never went back. I started off by investigating Bosnia. I worked on the cases of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, the politician and soldier that are currently on trial in The Hague for the activities you see on the screen behind me. I also conducted led the investigation in the siege of Sarajevo element of Slobodan Milosevic's trial. I worked in Kosovo, investigating mass graves and carrying out mass exhumations of the bodies that were killed in the incidents there. This is a little village here where all the caskets you see in front of you actually belong to one family. The small ones were where the children were herded by the people that did this into a little gully, a stream gully, and then hand grenaded until they were all dead. I was the director of the evidence unit on Saddam Hussein's trial. A slightly unusual one for me because I'm not a particular believer in the death penalty, but I do believe in people having fair trials. So I worked on that. And there was an interesting 3 years in Iraq during some of the worst of the fighting that took place. We were trying to conduct war crimes trials during that period. I advised the Libyan Ministry of Justice, and a very interesting period that was, when people who hadn't been able to investigate and prosecute crimes for years were now suddenly faced with the opportunity to do so. Last year, I didn't investigate war crimes in Gaza. I must stress this. I went there to observe. The decision on whether war crimes have been committed has yet to be made. And I had colleagues on the other side of the fence investigating from the Israeli side. But we investigated all sorts of incidents that took place. This one here, for instance, is a young lady whose very close male relative was carrying a white flag of surrender in one hand and a copy of the Quran in the other when a bullet was fired through him, out through the window, and it's the hole that you see there. So that's the type of thing that I was doing last year. I was observing the aftermath and sometimes the actual incidents that were taking place. This gentleman, a most touching piece of human communication, he just took me to his front door because that's all that he had left. And he said, "Please tell the world," in effect asking me to communicate for him, this is what I've got. The rubble behind him, which was his house, is neatly piled because they had to get diggers to it looking for the dead relatives. And that's a place in southern Gaza where the smell of decomposing flesh was still very fresh in the air. Communications-wise, when I've been working with these people, I've had to communicate face-to-face. And that is my argument today. In the modern digital world, we still have a need for face-to-face communication. I cannot take back to a court or an inquiry board that I work for anything other than the truth, and a complete version of the truth. Even when the truth is told by the media, perhaps, you only get clips and snippets. I need to go there and actually see what I see and bring back the whole thing. That can only be done by face-to-face communication. I'm going to go through now some of the regions and experiences I've had. I've actually looked at what I'm going to tell you and realised that I've probably got more mistakes in here than top tips for successful communication. But hopefully I've learned by the mistakes that I've made, because my communication experience has changed over the years from one of just being a local lad in a small English county through to where I am today, which is a bit more international, I guess. The history of it all: I grew up in a small rural town. We communicated easily because we were communicating with people who looked like us, sounded like us, understood the same things. You didn't have to put the effort into communication that you have to when you're dealing with complete strangers. I joined the army. That was a bit of a shock to the system, because although we were all carrying the same passport, all of a sudden I was meeting people from a wide variety of cultures. A new thing was introduced in that there was very much the sort of officer and soldier relationship. That was something that was new to me, and I had to work that one out. So we were communicating in new and more challenging ways. I remember being sent to Northern Ireland and having a group of people that were perfectly lovely, but they would occasionally suddenly decide they didn't like us. The nationalist community were, I would say, incredibly keen to communicate, but restricted by it's not being safe to be seen to communicate. And I remember a very successful communication device that they used with us was the Fermanagh finger. I worked in County Fermanagh. They'd be driving along and they wanted to acknowledge the presence of the army, but they didn't want to be seen, so they would just raise up the Fermanagh finger. That's all you've got. But that little communication actually was, "Good morning, how are you? We're friends." On the other side, I would also remember a very strange experience, which was having a great big stone, lump of brick thrown at me by a man carrying a British flag. And that's very confusing for a member of the British Army. Now, he wasn't ready to communicate maybe, or maybe he'd been trying to communicate, but nobody was listening to him, and he was just fed up. I don't know. I never spoke to him. But it was strange having that flag there. I joined the police service, and communication is your job every day. You just talk to people. But I remember one particular lesson. There was an incident when I was called out in the early hours of the morning, and somebody had fired some shots. Nobody had been hit at that stage, but I went into the office, and the detective chief inspector, who was a bit Sweeney-ish, I must say, but he was an old school sort of policeman, he asked me to go down, get to speak to 3 or 4 lads that had witnessed this shooting. And I said, "Look, there's a bobby down there, uniform bobby, I'll just give him a call and get an update for you." He went incandescent with rage, said, "You will get down there yourself and get in their face and find out what's gone on." He wasn't interested in a bit of a chat over the phone. He wanted face-to-face communication. And he was right. It's how I found out what had gone on. I also remember one day a senior officer with a radio handset, and there was a bit of a communication breakdown. The radio wasn't working very well. He couldn't hear, and he became madder and madder to the point he actually started smashing the radio handset down on the desk and broke the end of it. I did think, well, that's the end of communication, full stop. You've broken your own communication device there. So the police was a communication job. But then, as I mentioned earlier, I joined the UN Tribunal. I went to Bosnia. Totally different culture. All of a sudden I'd gone international, and I was meeting not only the people we were interviewing, the Bosnians, the Serbs, the Croats, but also my UN buddies were from all over the world, and we would say things and not quite understand one another. Our languages were different. We were all communicating in English, but did we really, really communicate? The lesson I learned was to actually communicate with people by just keeping it simple, being totally truthful, and being completely professional. I managed to actually interview a lady for 3 days one day, or 3 days, wait, one day, 3 days, one day at a time, who, in a culture where you don't really talk to men particularly strange men, she told me about the horrors that she'd been through, and particularly, and in gruesome detail, which I'm not going to go into, the sexual offences that had been put and meted out on to her. Terrible ones that were designed not only to be physically uncomfortable and painful and all of the things we might imagine, but to really play long-term psychological tricks. And she told these and explained these to a complete stranger, a foreigner. I communicated, a little bit by accident, but it was all about just telling the truth and being straightforward and not judging her. I went to Iraq. Very difficult communicating in Iraq, different languages. I was living with the Americans, I was working for the Americans. Boy oh boy is it difficult to communicate at times. The same people, or so we think, but boy oh boy they're not. Even we had communication like this. This was originally where Saddam, sorry my mouth's gone rather dry here, where Saddam Hussein was going to be executed. Even at the man's last moments, they are communicating with him by telling him that he is offended in the face of God and he'll die in the face of God. The interesting communication point is not just that, but I've had this translated by probably half a dozen Arabic speakers, and they've all translated it differently. You just don't know what you're actually saying when you start using different languages. Last year I was in Gaza, and I had the challenge of interviewing the family of this young man. I think you've probably seen that on the news. It's a very common photograph, some boys. But I mentioned the media. This came back as a story of an Israeli Navy ship shelling some boys on the beach. They were shelled on the beach, but I know evidentially, because of the research I've done, it wasn't by a ship. I won't go any further than that, but it just shows how the media tell you what they see and what they record. It isn't always exactly right. Not lies, but not necessarily the truth. The UN were communicating here out of desperation. They painted their initials on the roof of the hotel so that Israelis wouldn't bombard them. May I have some water, please? The locals were trying to communicate, hoping the media would pass this message out. I thought it was very defiant, and with the exception, I think, of one mistake. Sorry, can you flick the slide on, please? With the exception of one mistake, I think, in very good English. I defied some places in England to actually come out with that standard of English. But I'd like to talk about this lady to try to sum up the whole sort of experience. This is a lady called Hafiza, the one on the left. The remainder are just a few of the survivors from her family. That's her home behind. It is a hovel. She wouldn't mind me saying that. They're a peasant family from Kosovo. One day in 1999, she heard the rumbling of tanks, although she didn't realise they were tanks, and paramilitaries from the Serbian troops, paramilitaries, arrived in her village in Kosovo. As is the way in those parts, when a son reaches a certain age, the son will build his house, and effectively the village becomes one large extended family commune. The sons, her brothers, were dragged out of their various houses and taken to a courtyard, quite near where you see there. She was dragged out at the same time as her father and was clinging on to her father, and she told me when I interviewed her that she got her fingers tucked under his watch. He was hot and sweaty, it was a hot summer's day, and that's how she was getting some purchase. He wouldn't let go of her and she wouldn't let go of him, so eventually the Serbian soldiers communicated by putting a gun to his head and blowing his head off, and she had to let go. We then, after this incident, arrived, and when I turned up at the village when I say we turned up, we were several weeks after this, but she was the only real person of age, maturity, that was left. There were women who wouldn't come out and speak, but the old men had run off completely and had stayed away, and there were a few little boys left. And she became my right-hand man, woman. But she spent 3 weeks with me while we carried out a series of exhumations. We communicated through an interpreter and through looks and smiles, and I actually enjoyed her company dramatically. It was really, really good to be around her. And she became the sort of person we turned to if I said I needed something, she would get it fixed. We had a Canadian forensic team that actually carried out the task. An interesting thing, I've always thought of Canadians as being a bit like the Americans, a bunch of Brits, but just on the other side. We found that it was completely different. We saw things differently, and I had to learn quickly. I hadn't worked with that many Canadians before. They would do things sometimes that I didn't want them to do. And when we discussed it, I could tell that the communication was difficult, despite the fact we were all speaking English. We had a Finnish military team, the Finnish army, come along. Very difficult to communicate. Perfect English, but no flexibility or understanding. If you said that's what you wanted, that's what you got. It wasn't a question of them interpreting it as I would have expected them. And one day I asked the Sergeant Major to put a guard around the mass grave site, and I said, I need a guard this area blocking off here. So he positioned his troops there. What I hadn't expected him to do was actually put them right there, because it was downwind of the exhumation tunnel, the autopsy tunnel, which we made out of tentage to put a great big fan at the top to blow the flies off the bodies while they were actually being examined, because the forensic scientists couldn't work with their scalpels because of the number of flies. So they actually stood there, and these poor soldiers were being bombarded by flies being blasted at 30 miles an hour amidst this terrible smell. And they looked rather strange because they'd all put huge great wads of cotton wool up their nose. But the communication had been, guard this area, and that's what they'd done. Whereas I'd expected my communication to have been understood as, just make sure the area is secure. How you do it is up to you. This was the village. It was actually the case that they'd put the bodies into the village graveyard in shallow graves for us to come along. And we had this fantastic communication, face-to-face thing, where we dug them up, we had the bodies identified, and if you look to the, this area here, this almost became a sort of, well, it was a walkway, but there was a massive significance, because they would not cross this to our side, and we didn't cross it to their side, because these were the reburial graves. And we had a very simple business of, when we finished with the body, we'd wrap it up in this, one of these tarpaulins, and we'd go down and very quietly hand it over. Not a word was said, but boy oh boy were we communicating. And they would then take them away and carry out the burial. At the end of all this, we had a very strange day. It was a memorial service at which about 5,000 people from all over came along. By this stage, the situation had changed slightly in that her elders and her brother, who'd been working in Germany, returned. At one point he came and sat next to me and sat in silence for 10 minutes, stood up at the end of it, shook my hand, nodded and walked off. We were face to face and not a word was spoken, but it communicated so much. Hafiza wasn't to be seen that day at the start. She'd been sent and basically put at the back because she was a woman. What did surprise me was then they asked me to speak at the memorial service. I hadn't prepared anything because I didn't know. I thought I'd do the first half in English and the second half in Albanian. There was one problem. I don't speak Albanian. So I wrote it down, and anyway, I stood there and I said a few words, a few pathetic words, but I was trying to get across to them, trying to communicate with them that we were trying to do something. The second half I did in Albanian, and when I came off the stage, the guy who'd been up there interpreting, this man next to me here, said that it was brilliant. You got your point across superbly. They loved it. I communicated. He did say, he did add, that I speak Albanian with a broad Chinese accent. But I stood there talking to 5,000 people, and they felt something. I certainly felt something. Just before I went on stage, Hafiza, who'd been absent, as I mentioned, suddenly appeared from nowhere and produced a watch. If you look here, she made me put it on. It was the watch that we dug up that was still on her father's wrist when we exhumed him. And she said, thank you, we probably won't see each other ever again. And I just wanted to say thank you before you say goodbye. And she asked me if I'd wear it. That's the watch. And my point is, ladies and gentlemen, is that I love all this new stuff, and I think it's fantastic. And I think it is not something that we should ever ignore, and we should celebrate it. But in my world, certainly, and I think in everybody's world, there is room still as much as ever for face-to-face communication.